Namaste. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Kamal Madi Shetty, and you're tuned into Season 4 of the Festival of Bharat. As I have always said, we are a platform that believes in having open and frank conversations about Bharat with no holds barred. And today, we are not just discussing about Bharat, but also about what Bharat is not. And we are going to do that by discussing media narratives about Bharat, particularly focusing on the menace of misinformation and by examining some of the most notoriously manufactured and manipulated media narratives about India. We couldn't have got a better person to discuss all this than the guest we have with us today, and that is Anand Ranganathan ji. Anand ji needs no introduction, but my favorite way of introducing him is that he is a scientist by profession and a wordsmith by craft. He has a PhD from Cambridge University and is currently a scientist at the Special Center for Molecular Medicine at JNU. He's an author, commentator, and is very well known for his accurate and precise comments on public issues, especially on national media. So we are going to pick his brains on a number of issues. Namaste, Anandji, and welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Thank you very much, Kamal. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Anandji, I want to, like I said, talk about a number of issues. And the one I want to begin, and when you look at the media, when you look at narratives, the one which comes to mind when you look at, let's say, the last 2 or 3 decades, one of the biggest false narratives in modern India, I would say, was built around 2002. Now, this was an era where social media didn't exist. And even now, even today, 2 decades after, roughly 2 decades after 2002, a lot of people continue to spread information and lies about what really, happened. So I want to understand from you, how do you look at 2002 and the events in 2002 in the state of Gujarat? And can you deconstruct this smear campaign, particularly against Prime Minister Modi ji for us?
Yeah, so in fact, that's a very interesting question and a very pertinent one in today's time. In fact, when there is so much censorship all around, and we're just hearing about Twitter censoring Donald Trump and blocking him and all that. And we are talking about the time, which is almost 20 years now, 19 years. And as you correctly pointed out, that was a time where there was no social media, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know about Facebook, but certainly Twitter wasn't there. WhatsApp obviously wasn't there. And all our news used to be, and the channels, I think there was only NDTV that used to come through Star News, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And of course, Doordarshan, which was a government, you can say government-owned propaganda site, it still is. But other than that, all our news used to come from newspapers, like the Hindu, Times of India, and all the other, main print, what they call mainstream media. And now looking back, a few things can be said, which is that the amount of misinformation that would have been spread would have been truly phenomenal. Because if there is one thing that has happened in the last, I would say, 7 years, 6 years, if you want to put it as the time from 2014 onwards, it is that people have recognized what are facts and what are opinions. So they can clearly make out. And in fact, if people they are still able to pardon people who give opinions, because that's your opinion. That can be completely wrong, or it can be right, or it can be structured on facts or not, but it's opinion. And they can differentiate that between what people give out as facts. But when you're talking about 2002, and I look back, upon if I seem to remember the kind of articles that were written, they were purely opinionated, with no facts at all. And just imagine there was, an audience would read it, for example, in a newspaper, and other than flinging the newspaper against the wall, you had no option, because there was no Twitter, or any other social media platform for you to give out the facts and to say that, look, what you're saying is completely wrong. So, and that narrative continued for 3 or 4 years. And there are two things here. Number one is that we know how deeply damaging that kind of narrative would have been to the national psyche. Because here we had in 2020, beginning of 2020, in the age, in the full glare of 24-hour news channels and social media, you can say pretty matured social media. I mean in a negative as well as positive sense. And yet, you had the Delhi riots, as we all saw through them, being declared as a pogrom, as an anti-Muslim pogrom. So right when you have in the social media age something that is being screened and being videographed by everyone on the road, and all the videos are there, that completely exposed this propaganda that was spread that it is an purely an anti-Muslim pogrom. So when you can have that in 2020, can you imagine without the means of 24-hour news channels or non-left media or social media, there would have been no opposition to the propaganda that was spread in 2002. So this is what is glaring, that in one sense, nothing has changed, because if amongst all the social media, platforms and freedom, you can call it, if still there are people and there are journalists, so-called senior journalists, established journalists, still saying that the riots were and purely an anti-Muslim pogrom, that Hindus weren't affected, that the state orchestrated it, what can you say? You can only correlate it to what was happening before the age of essence. So it is scary in one sense. It is really scary. But we, of course, we lived through that age. And the amazing thing is that now when you look back, of course, you can't remember half the things that were being shown, because NDTV, in fact, even Narendra Modi was interviewed by Ms. Madhu Kishwar, and he gave two examples of two journalists who were out to create mayhem just for the heck of it, as a propaganda. Other than that, what astonishes me is that still some of the lies that were propagated then, 19, 20 years ago, they still have almost, in a very cynical way, I can put it, stood the test of time. And two of them come to my mind. Other than the fact that, of course, the SIT gave a clean chit to Narendra Modi, and there are people who still don't believe that. They would, when it suits them, they believe the judiciary. When it doesn't suit them, then they don't believe the judiciary. So they would never accept that the Supreme Court has said that Narendra Modi is not culpable for that those riots. Plus, they very conveniently try and overlook the fact that those riots were a reaction to one of the most heinous crimes ever committed in India, which was 54 Hindus who were brutally burnt alive in a coach. So that slowly, and we have seen over the years, NYT, they try, and it's very difficult for them to airbrush it, because there was evidence and people knew the truth. But believe me, 50 years ago, they would have airbrushed it. And you can see it as remnants in NYT when they try and slip in these lines that, there was a fire that broke out on the Sabarmati Express, 50 people were killed because a fire broke out, right? Now, 50 years ago, without any, photographs, without any evidence of the victims, this would have been the prevailing thing, because that is how propaganda becomes concretized, is crystallized. And that itself is a window to the world, to a scary world where there are people who are just not willing to accept the truth, whatever the truth may be. And so two instances that come to mind is that how Narendra Modi was maligned, and I can think of only two there. I'm sure there are more. One was the fact that people still say that he was castigated by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, by saying that Raj Dharm ka palan hona chahiye. Now, the clips are still there. So people can go and see the clips. And despite that, this propaganda spread. So what happened was that Vajpayee and Narendra Modi were sitting side by side, having a press conference. And somebody asked a question, and Atalji said, Raj Dharm ka palan hona chahiye. And then Narendra Modi told Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was the Prime Minister, wahi to kar rahe hain. And 2 seconds later, Vajpayee said, and this is on record, हाँ वही हो रहा है, मुझे यकीन है, or something like that, वही राजधर्म का पालन ही हो रहा है. Now that is conveniently omitted, and people say that, look, Vajpayee castigated Narendra Modi ki Rajdharm ka palan hona chahiye aur wo nahi ho raha. The other more blatant lie that is still being spread, and I wrote a piece on this because I caught red-handed the fellow, the senior journalist, I call him Michelangelo, who was spreading this lie, even 20 years down the line, that Narendra Modi said every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? Now, this was kind of tied to, or kind of to cushion the almost barbaric, cruel quote of Rajiv Gandhi saying that, in the aftermath of the anti-Sikh pogrom, that was a genocide, that Rajiv Gandhi said, when a big tree falls, the earth shakes. So people, equated that and said, look, this monster Narendra Modi has said every action has a reaction. So his action, according to him, were the burning alive of 54 Hindus, and the reaction are these riots. Now they, shockingly, they leave out what he said immediately after he said this. And it is amazing how, and that's when you know that they are spreading propaganda, because what he said was that, and I want neither the action nor the reaction. This is what he said. And now that is conveniently left out. So what can you, this is what I say, that you cannot cure these propagandists. You can only expose them. And with the onset of social media now, you can, there are people who expose lies, by the minute. Earlier, they used to take a month. You would see something in the Hindu, and you would, religiously write a letter, dear editor, this is wrong and all that. And 99% chances are they would never be published. So there goes the, you're trying to expose them. Then social media came, but it took time. And now it's kind of, when I say mature, and I really mean it in a negative as well as a positive sense, because in a negative sense, in almost a cynical way, there are fact checkers, but even fact checkers have their ideologies now. When you are checking facts, you must be completely devoid of all propaganda, all allegiances, all ideologies, because it's almost a scientific process. You look at something and you decide whether this is true or this is false. This is black and white. It's not gray. But there are fact checkers who pick and choose, what they need to fact check. And if there is something which is inconvenient, they, skip it out. So now we've reached an age where even fact checking is ideology centric. So I don't know where we're headed, but certainly we are at a much better position than what we were, back then in 2002.
Right. Thank you, Anandji. I'm going to come back to some of the later things that you said, like fact checking, and I think social media itself today is undergoing so much of churn, and there's so much of questions being raised. But talking about Prime Minister Modi ji, I think he, even after coming to power as a Prime Minister after 2014, he has been a target of so many smear campaigns, so to say. For example, his personal life has been used to discredit him. And even his clothes, we remember the pinstripe suit that he wore, that was used against him. Some people have a problem with his foreign trips, even though they are for the country, right? So can you tell us about these narratives, which the post-2014 narratives about the Prime Minister?
Yeah, look, I think he has a very thick skin, but it is not, I would say, the thickest of skins, because if it were, then he would be, addressing a lot of press conferences, and he hasn't. But I think that's a very conscious choice he has made. Maybe he was so aggrieved by the propaganda that the media, had against him for a decade before he became the Prime Minister. That is, one person comes to mind is Amitabh Bachchan. There was one falsehood that was written about him. I think he said this in fair. And for the next 15, 20 years, he did not give a single interview. But of course, he's not a politician. He's not in public life. So, he can do that. Politicians really cannot escape the public scrutiny or public glare now comes intertwined with public scrutiny. So in that sense, he has a thick skin, but he's not the thickest of skin. On the other hand, be that as it may, be that as it what it is, which is his conscious decision to not to pick and choose the people he gives interviews to, and to never give a press conference. Other than that, I think we shouldn't look too much into all the maligning or the hate that people have against Narendra Modi. He's a politician, and I think at one level he also understands that. And to be honest, I think Amit Shah also gets, if not the same, at the same level, maybe a little bit lower. Yogi, I think Yogi gets more than Amit Shah. So there is a kind of a hierarchy. And you can almost look at the hierarchy and almost predict who's going to be the next prime minister. But, the fact of the matter is he's a politician. It's not that he hasn't given it back. I mean, he has also given it back in equal measure. He's called Sonia Gandhi the Jersey cow. He's addressed Shashi Tharoor, as someone having a 50. So in politics, it goes. Hate comes with the territory, and I'm not that much concerned. And I mean, for example, if somebody hates me, does Modi come to my rescue? No. So he doesn't even know me, so he doesn't care. But the tragedy that has happened is in this mania, Modi hatred mania, it has somehow over the last 6 years, it's transmogrified into hatred for Hinduism, which still I would say it's I don't like it, but it's still all right because you're hating a religion, you're hating an idea. Let's say, people hate Islam, people hate Christianity, still all right. But now what has happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that also has transmogrified into hatred for India, and that is really dangerous because the people, now we know clearly, when you started hating Modi, that was fine, but then you started hating everything that he ever did for this country. Now that can't be right. In the last 6 years, there have been at least 1,000 things, maybe more, that this government has done. So let's say half of them were horrendous. You wrote about them, that's fine. But at least the other half, 500, would have been good steps, decent steps. How is it possible that you are running a media house or a TV channel, or let's say a digital media house, and out of all the things that this government has done, you can't find a single thing that he must have done right? That itself tells you that you're running an agenda. To give you one example, this making of toilets, Shauchalay, you had the scheme, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Now the opposition to that was, believe it or not, that they're saying this is wrong because by building toilets, you are preventing the village women to have that bonding time that they used to have when they went to the fields in the morning. Now, can you imagine somebody would have thought, let us think of, some angle to oppose this. Making of a toilet is actually going to reduce the mortality. It is going to take care of all the diseases. It is good. It is health conscious. It is a great step. But God damn, because Modi has done this, let us find something that is wrong. So can you imagine the editorial staff would have stood, sat around a table and tried to find out what angle. And this is the angle that they found, that Swachh Bharat is bad because it is preventing or taking away the bonding time of two females. So when you see things like that, and this is just one example, there are so many examples like that, and then you realize that, look, there's no point, because these guys are beyond redemption. They've completely lost it. So to come back to the question that you asked, I don't really mind people hating Modi. I think he has a thick skin, but when that thing transmogrifies into hatred for India, that is when you realize that, look, this has gone beyond, something has to be done.
Right. And I think a lot of times things that people have advocated for in the past, they turn against themselves in a way, just because Modi is doing it.
No, well, I mean, this is almost an axiom in the age that we are living in. Anything that you loved, because Modi has now done it, you start hating. And the farm bills were a glowing example of that, when all those so-called intellectuals and economists and politicians, they were all for these reforms. In fact, they were for even stronger and more stringent reforms than what Modi has done right now. Modi has given a choice that you will still have your Bicholias or Aratyas, you will still have your APMCs, but I'm giving you a choice. Those guys wanted to do away with the choice, and now they have taken a U-turn now. So, but see, I'll tell you what the tragedy is, that once you realize this propaganda is going on, there are two options. One is that you expose it and then you sit back. The other is And that is what I worry for this country, that that leads to depression and that leads to a loss, not only to the exchequer, but to the psyche of the common Indian. For example, now this expose that, all the U-turns and hypocrisy on farm bill was exposed almost 1.5 months ago. Now, in any sensible country running a sensible government, once this is exposed, you would not have allowed the farmers, so-called farmers who are holding blocking roads, hold the country to ransom. We're withstanding 3,500 crore losses every day. Now, why are we doing this? Who is going to pay for this? The farmers won't pay for this. Is the government going to pay for this? Ultimately, the government is going to pay for this. And how is the government earning money? Through us. So at one point, once you expose the hypocrisy, you feel good, but only for 5-10 minutes. After that, you start feeling depressed because ultimately all this loss, the inaction of the government is going to bite you and you can't do anything about it. For example, it is my money which runs this government, on which the government takes decisions. And ultimately, that 3,500 crores multiplied by 40, 50 days is going to be taken out of our pockets and we are helpless. So it can lead to depression, and that is what scares me. That and what Narasimha Rao said once is a very famous, or shall I say, infamous quip. What he said was terribly depressing, but it's an iconic quote. What he said was, "To not take a decision is to also take a decision." Now, it is so ridiculously cynical, but it is true. I mean, he did this so many times. But it is depressing because when you don't take a decision and you think that is also taking a decision, let the farmers be there for 6 months, let the roads be blocked to a national capital. Let all the factories that are, on the road, on the periphery of those highways, they suffer. Let no goods be, exchanged from one state to the other. Who is suffering? We are suffering. So it's all right to expose the hypocrisy, but if the government remains, impotent to the threat, I would call it a threat. It is a severe economic threat. It's not yet become a social threat. It might, because there are people itching to instigate riots. But as far as economic threat is concerned, this should have been handled 50 days ago. Yeah.
Absolutely, Anandji. I think, like you rightly said, it's gone beyond the limit, and it's really about hating and opposing everything for the sake of it. So when we look at the big picture, like you have sort of shared your views on this already, but I want to sort of go deeper into some of the narratives that we've had, not necessarily only in the last 1 or 2 years, but even if you go back a little bit. And I want to go back to this whole narrative about church attacks, which was conveniently peddled just before, I think, the Delhi election or something, right? And so what was the truth behind these cases? Because you have suddenly things happening for no rhyme or reason. I mean, there's no logic to something just happening like that all of a sudden. But it did, according to the people who wanted us to believe it did. So how was this narrative like this built?
Yeah. So, in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that, because as far as narratives, fake narratives go, that is right up there. That is the Mount Everest, because that was the first time. And Modi had just taken over, the government. It was end of 2014. And the first 3 or 4 months, he wasn't really visible. I think he was a bit anxious, having come from Gujarat, taking so much responsibility. He was not as proactive as a prime minister as what he's now. So, and that happened at, I think, November, December, and January. And as you said, in February was the Delhi election. So those 2-3 months. And that was so frustrating because that was the first inkling I got that people could be so shamelessly propagandist. That's the first inkling. Believe me, before that, I would trust a lot of people. But then that instant I realized that, look, you can't trust me. And the reason for that was that ultimately each one of those instances of the so-called church attack were regular burglaries, regular robberies that had happened in UPA as well. And all that data, which this government should have brought out the next day the propaganda started, they never did. They never did for 30, 40 days. So, when you when you talk, and at that point of time, the social media wasn't that active, because everyone was finding their moorings. People weren't so shockingly distrustful of the media that they would immediately take it as a lie and start busting it. There was still some, you can say, inertia into mistrusting, any news that came out, especially out of mainstream media. But then slowly people realized that all those instances were, completely fake, in the sense that, they weren't communal. There was another one, so-called exalted journalist, quote unquote journalist, who even attributed a rape of a nun to an RSS affiliated organization. So all these things happened, and then you had these banner headlines in Times of India and other newspapers. Enough, say, very Christians. Every day you would have. I wrote a piece on this as well. Every day you would have, Christians, so-called intellectuals, and the kind of known people with Christian surnames and Christians come on television, write articles, op-eds saying that this is not the country I knew it to be. Julio Ribeiro comes to mind. He was the one who actually started this. And then the data comes in, not only the previous year's data, where during UPA there were more such church attacks than during NDA. But all these, when investigated, were found out to be, non-communal at all, non-communal, each one of them, including the rape of the nun that was carried out by Bangladeshi immigrants. And it was so heartbreaking at one sense, because then you realize that, they want to destroy the psyche of, so if they are going to be like this in the first 6 months of Modi government, they are going to be like this for the next 6 years. And that is what we've seen. But that was the first inkling. And I'll never forget, what happened after that. Then came Intolerance and, award, Wapsi and all those things. But each one of them has been demolished. Now these guys are running around. They don't know what to do. So, they're like, Bahar ka danga fasad, वो discuss करके उसको attribute करें यहाँ पे, like what is happening in America and things of that sort. But you see, one thing I realized, that as I said, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, that you cannot cure these people. I realized it, and you can only expose them. And the church attack was the first instance when I actually realized. And then a certain calmness descends, because once for example, the same thing has happened in my case as far as Arvind Kejriwal is concerned. I would get so perturbed because he was, quote unquote, he marketed himself also as one of us, fighting, common man, aam aadmi, Lakshman ka, wohi shirt bahar hai, chappal pehne hue hai, fighting, and all that image was, he's one of us, and he's gone there, and he's going to fight for us. But now he's turned out to be like Lalu Prasad Yadav, and I never get angry at whatever Lalu Prasad Yadav does, because I know that is what he is destined to do. He's going to do that. So a certain calmness is there. And that is what has happened even with propaganda. You see something, you're not perturbed in the sense that you're not aggravated, you're not angry anymore, because this is what they do. So in a way, with this plethora of propaganda coming in a very macabre way, it has kind of helped. If every year there was one propaganda, then you would be very perturbed. You write reams of op-eds on it against its facts and all that. But now if there is one propaganda every day, then that there's almost like a avalanche, and you stop worrying about
it. Right. And I think, like you said, if the narrative around this church attacks which began, if that's up there, I think one other such case study, if I can call it that, something that people can actually look for and understand if they want to understand misinformation and propaganda, is now not last year, but around the end of 2019, which was the anti-CAA protests. So I wanted to ask you about that. It was a very different kind of misinformation, different kind of propaganda, because it was mixed with on the ground sort of protests. So one was feeding into each other. So what kind of role did misinformation and propaganda sort of play in those, those anti-CAA, anti-NRC protests, and which finally led to the Delhi riots?
Yeah, I think, Kaush, it was, as I was saying, in a very cynical way, there have been so many propagandas that we almost forget the So CAA happened almost ages ago, but it happened only a year ago. And when it happened, I remember, almost daily I used to talk about this. I used to give facts, 7 or 8 facts on why CAA is good, why it is not. So, but it's difficult for me to remember right now, but I'll try to. I think what happened was that these guys felt, especially after Modi coming to power again, and after the abrogation of Article 370 that happened immediately after he came, took office the second time, and I think 5th August was the Article 370 abrogation, and then came the CAA. So these guys were totally frustrated. They were so they were like, it was an attempt to vent so much anger that was pent up over the last 6 years, impotent anger, anger that could not result in Modi being beaten in 2019 elections, and that just spilled on. And in a very strange way, the BJP also supported it because it was clearly an illegal protest. They had blocked a road. They were inconveniencing millions of commuters, Delhiites. It was clearly Hindu-phobic. All that anger that came out was pure Hindu-phobia, and there were calls, five-year-old children saying, "We're going to kill Modi. I'm going to kill Amit Shah." And there were 4 infants who died in that bitter cold as well, and they were proclaimed as martyrs. And so all those things were happening, and the BJP kind of did not, did not do anything about it. So I still don't know the reason why. I think they thought that maybe it's going to translate into so much anger against this that it's going to help them. Ultimately, they're also politicians. They're not doodh ke dhula koi nahi. So, but it actually led to riots. So I think had they acted swiftly in November, the riots wouldn't have happened. But again, CAA again was, as you mentioned, it was Congress and Communist CPIM resolutions saying that they wanted something very similar. When they were in power in 2012, 2015, their resolutions were that Bangladeshi minorities should be given an asylum in India. Now, who are Bangladeshi minorities? Are they Muslims? No, because Bangladeshi, majority is it's a Muslim majority country. So the minorities are Hindus and Christians and Sikhs, or whatever little Sikhs there are, few Sikhs there are. So when Congress and CPIM wanted that, then it was fine, But when BJP, kind of said that this is going to happen, and why should? Because and we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, I dug out so much data on the population census and all those things. I mean, I can't even remember half of it now. Plus, the fact of the matter is that this was an amnesty scheme, This was not, it was, I think, December 31st, 2014. Before that, whoever had, I can't even remember the specifics, I'm afraid, because as I said, so much water has flown under the bridge since then. But the fact was, this was a purely propaganda and false narrative driven protest. And it was a protest to make Muslims kind of, quote unquote, stand up against the power of a state. Almost like what happened in Direct Action Day. It was almost kind of to bring back that ghosts of Jinnah. You could see it from the slogans, you could see it from the marches, and La ilaha illallah. You could see the Shahada replacing the Ashok Chakra of the tricolor, and it was certainly that attempt to display a power that we are not. Of course, I don't consider them as a minority, but it was they themselves say that they are a minority. They're not. I mean, if you look at Kashmir, 95% Muslim Kashmir Valley, and but this was certainly an attempt to display that power. And you saw journalists saying that abhi आप हिंदूज को भी इसमें शामिल होने दें, अभी वेट करें जब हमें पावर मिलेगी. So all those kind of things were happening in 1940s. What Ambedkar warned us about, started to happen now. And but I think people saw through it. And what I would say is that the coronavirus and the lockdown kind of put an end to it. Otherwise, these protests would have continued, because you really can't stop this behemoth. Once you have religion and bigotry in the name of religion, and you have this kind of brotherhood coming together, God knows what comes. You really cannot predict You can't predict what will happen, because that is based on the principles that are devoid of all facts. I mean, it's like saying that science, it's a science versus religion debate. It goes nowhere. You're not going to convince somebody that Jesus did not walk on water, or of immaculate conception, or a flying horse, or so many other things. You just have to leave it at that.
Right. Um, Anandji, when we talk about Delhi riots, I think one other thing that happened just a few months later was the rioting in Bangalore, although for a shorter period of time. But uh, you know, there is very little spoken about it, and I think that has, in a way, to do with what the trigger was for it. And this was also a time when those of us who have been following you regularly on Twitter, we know that you were your account was suspended on Twitter. And today, just today, we've seen Donald Trump's account being suspended, and that again raises that question about where are social media giants headed? Because when social media came in, a lot of us were very hopeful, that this will be the regulator of sorts for the mainstream media. This will sort of empower people to actually call out a lot of false narratives. But today, what we are seeing is that social media itself, has, it's a reason for us to debate and explore what is the way that we have to go forward. So, how do you look at these social media platforms today? Who have taken it upon themselves to again do some things that a certain section of intellectuals used to do earlier, which is to control the way people think and sort of curate things, and they have sort of ceasing to be a medium in that sense. So how do you look at this?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. And first of all, let me be the question of Bangalore riots, as you know, and I never fail, I never tire of using this, saying this phrase that we we spare the fundamentals, but we snare the fundamentalists. And this is what people who condemned the Bangalore riots they did. They did not mention the fact that blasphemy is a punishable offense in Islam. And the reason for that is that it has been condemned in the most strictest of terms in their holy book. So it is the fundamentals that are telling you how to act. And if somebody who believes in fundamentals is a fundamentalist, but fundamentalist is thought of as an extremist or radical. There's nothing radical in it. And that is what happened. Kamlesh Tiwari was one example. He was beheaded. And as we know, Mr. Owaisi and so many others, they almost did not, short of rejoicing his beheading, they were quite all right with it. It is because they genuinely feel, Gustakh Rasool ki ek hi saza sar tan se juda hai. And this is the problem, that, when you talk about, so much hate being in the open, when you talk about SM or MSM acting against hate, and when you point out hate or hatred or bigotry, what you never point out is, the biggest mainstreaming of hate is actually religion. And you're absolutely fine with it. So much so that Indian infants who are aged 1 to 3 have been, 155 million of them have been categorized as Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and Isai. Now, did the census lady or census man, I asked, knock on the door, and the door was opened by a 3-year-old or 2-year-old Indian infant, and the question was, are you a Muslim? Are you? And he said, no, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim. It is so bizarre. And the reasons, and that is why I worry for this country, because at one level we are progressing, and we want to shun so many things. But on the other hand, we are so all right with the mainstreaming of hatred, and we are so scared of pointing out the hatred that is spewed or that emanates from our scriptures, holy books. And this was the example, the Bangalore example that you took was exactly this. Now let me come to the strange thing that I feel as you're talking about the control. of the social media biggies, or they call the big tech or whatever. Now in India, ironically, you see, the control or the lessons, or the teachings or the preachings for someone to control something actually emanates from the state, because our constitution has articles written in it that are controlling. For example, we don't have our freedom of speech is subject to a lot of restrictions, and those restrictions were increased by Jawaharlal Nehru in the First Amendment. We know that Article 9, Clause 2A. So it is subject to public order, public decency, this, that. But the fact is, who is going to decide? Whenever you say something is subject to something, that this is hate speech, this is not, this is something which is bigoted, this is not this. You are the one who's editorializing. Not only you are choosing, you are acting as a judge, you're acting as a god, and it is completely subjective. I may think of something that was, for example, and my banning of Twitter is a perfect example. So my banning of Twitter, my banning by Twitter of the tweet where I quoted a holy verse was considered as a hate speech, and I was banned, I was blocked. But after 10 days, or after I think 15, 20 days, I can't remember, I was unblocked, and they apologized for it, because somebody must have told her, "Arey pagal ho gaya kya? Ye to verse hai. Why are you blocking him?" Because by that logic, what you're saying is that verse is hateful. Now you see what I mean.
You had put it verbatim.
Verbatim. It was a verbatim quote, and people checked it, of course, and that is the reason why Twitter apologized and unblocked me. But you see how juvenile adults have started behaving because of fear, because they inadvertently, almost immediately, you can say involuntarily, they read that tweet and they accepted that it is hateful, right? Any sensible guy, let's say in Twitter, or somebody, some guy on Twitter said, "Oh, this is hateful." Then after 14 days, realization dawns, fear comes in, creeps in. That are you saying that a holy verse is hateful? So Twitter would have paid with its, I don't know what, maybe riots, I don't know. So they quickly apologized. But what I'm trying to say is that we are so comfortable with this ever-present hate and hatefulness that comes out of our religious scriptures that we don't even consider it as hate. And if by accident, if reality strikes us without us knowing that what would happen 15 days from now, we say that it is hateful, we then get so fearful and say, no, we are wrong, that this is not hate. Now this is what is happening. For example, I'll tell you, and it's really sad, and it is more sad in America, because I would say I really like their First Amendment, because I think it comes closest to what I perceive should be freedom of speech. That I never say it should be absolute, in the sense that you can't have military secrets being divulged in the name of absolute freedom of speech. And if there is clear-cut, immediate, palpable incitement to riots, to violence, then that doesn't come into my criteria. Other than that, everything should be allowed, and that is essentially what American First Amendment is. If in that country you can have these guys who are SM chiefs and social directing, if in that country you can have so much power that these guys are now deciding what is hateful, what is not, what is going to incite, what won't, I think that is real tragedy, and that is very scary, because you have brought in gray in something that was almost black and white. And in India, we have always lived with this gray for the last 70 years. Congress, almost like a fascist state. The state is actually, if you look at it, all our rules that emanate from the Constitution are draconian. We still have Section 295A, where you cannot offend religious sensibility. It started with in fact, the Britishers didn't have it. We had the Rangila Rasool case, where Ilmuddin, assassinated the publisher of Rangila Rasool. There was no law. And Mahatma Gandhi, almost when he condemned the publication of Rangila Rasool, and he almost de facto asked for a law, Britishers brought in that law. That law is still there. It's been almost 100 years. And we are proud that law exists. Anyone who we consider is offending religious sensibility. Now, I ask you, who are you to judge which religious sensibility is being offended? You have a holy book where 53% of the verses are condemning the non-believers, are condemning the kafirs. Does that not offend my sensibilities? Forget about religious sensibilities. That offends my sensibilities. So can I take action? No, I can't take action. So when you have this hypocrisy that has been built into you, you are children of clause two, as I call them. We are all children of clause two. I, I really, you have to give up at some point of time. There's no point protesting about it because people are not going to change.
Right. And it's ironic that there is censorship for something like this, where things are either abstract or things are as they are, but people don't want to accept them even when it stares them in the face. But on the other hand, when you see actual things happening on the ground, which in a way aren't very convenient for a narrative, those are completely, ignored. For example, right, this last few months, I mean, there's been actual tangible violence in several temples in the state of Andhra Pradesh. But unfortunately, we don't hear about it in the public discourse, and especially when you look at the national media, or rather, I think we should call it Delhi media, because they hardly look at the rest of the country. So why is this? I mean, is this like communal reporting, and like what motivates the English in the Indian English media? Why is this disconnect from the ground realities?
See, that's a very interesting question, and allow me to delve into this a little bit more deeply. You see, the fact of the matter is that you cannot, as I said, you cannot cure these propagandists. They are like, I call them the rust beach. That every drop of blood spawns more of the same. And one needs to demolish their WhatsApp university propaganda in three parts. One, right from, as we were discussing, the fake church attack narrative and running selective hate trackers that so many people, including Swati of Swarajya, have demolished. Media has almost perfected the selective outraging and scaremongering. For example, we know who Akhlaq was, right? 2015, and it happened. Akhlaq, who was lynched because of beef being found with him on him. But do we know who was Banu or Khitaram Bhil? Do we know who was Savant Rathod? Do we know who was Vidhu Jain or Ayub or Farooq? Do we know who Farooq was? Do we know who Bharat Yadav was, who was lynched in 2019 after being called a kafir? So ask yourself why we don't know the names of these victims of Muslim hate crime lynching. Why? You see, these gangrenous selectivists were totally silent on more than 110, 120 Muslim mob hate attacks on Hindus and Muslims over the past year, including in Ranchi, by the way, where a mob segregated. I emphasize on the word, they segregated bus passengers based on their religion before wanting to set it on fire. But none of these attacks have elicited any condemnation by these so-called activists. Why? That itself tells you that they are selective propagandists. Number two, and as for such violence being mainstreamed by BJP politicians, look, of course it is condemnable when such instances. Of course, any sensible person would say it is downright condemnable. But again, these fake activists only highlight selectively. For example, they never outrage on the BSP selecting as a candidate a man who offered 51 crores to anyone who beheaded Charlie Hebdo journalist, or when Mehbooba Mufti selects a rape accused as a candidate, or condoles the death of Vani the terrorist, or when rape accused bishop is welcomed on streets of Jalandhar by the church officials and believers, or when the ex-vice president presents an award to the PFI chief, or when a Congress MLA says he won't work for Dalits as they didn't vote for him, or when Congress Harish Rawat says those who kill a cow should go to Pakistan, or when an SP legislator slaps a woman entering Haji Ali, or when a Congress legislator marches in support for hanging Kamlesh Tiwari, or when Yasin Malik is celebrated by Manmohan Singh, or when tens of thousands collect for funerals of terrorists, then it is not mainstreaming of violence. Finally, the third point, you see, in 2013, 5 Dalits were raped every day. The crime rate against Dalits in Kerala is higher than even the national figure according to NCRB. There was a 17% increase in crimes against Dalits under UPA 2. So the crime increased, but intolerance did not. Was Manmohan Singh mainstreaming violence? See, we must understand, to solve this problem, we have to first deal with it objectively. The fact of the matter is that we look at any assembly or our parliament, 30%, more than 30%, a third, maybe sometimes even 50% of our legislators are facing serious criminal charges of rape, dacoity, murder, kidnapping. When you have such people at the helm, you need to cure that, not look at selectively. And Dr. Ambedkar was the first to recognize the perils of selectivity and expose them. So, he's someone who completely exposed the ills of Hinduism. But in addition to doing that, he also exposed the ills of Islam, because he said those who are, keep on pointing out the ills of Hinduism, let others not believe that there are no ills in other religions. But the point is, we just worship Ambedkar. We don't follow him, because we fear him. Everyone fears Ambedkar. No, you've never heard, all these Velcro historians, as I call them, never talking about Ambedkar's quotes on Islam. They always talk about Ambedkar's quote on Hinduism, which they should. But they are being selective when they only selectively quote Ambedkar, and that happens for everything. So, as I said, this is just part of the propaganda, and people have seen through this. Just yesterday, 3 Hindu cattle smugglers, quote unquote smugglers, were lynched. Did you hear this news? No. Why? So when people understand that this is all selectivity, slowly and surely, they become almost vaccinated to this. And I think that is how we are destined to move forward, I'm afraid. Can't change this. We can only expose it.
Very insightful, Anandji. And I think selectivity is almost like a curse to our public life and society in general. And I think you've shared that very articulately. So I mean, we are talking about media, and we are talking about media narratives. And we cannot really have a complete discussion about media without talking about the Western media and the way Western media perceives India. And there are so many examples for this, from misrepresenting the whole abrogation of Article 370 to something like the CAA, or even generally it's casual laments about life in India in general. There are very strange lenses by which Western media looks at India. So how distorted are these perspectives by the Western media of India?
Oh, they are completely distorted. And as I tell you, one always, learns from the first instances that happens, and one never forgets them. So there have been hundreds of such, propagandists masquerading as op-ed writers for WAPO or NYT and so many. But I always remember the first one. Like I was telling you about the church attack. So the first one that, gave me this jhatka, that what the hell is going on, was that cartoon that appeared in New York Times. That was, I think, when ISRO had launched Chandrayaan. I don't know whether you remember that. They were like, two cows that come, and our space scientists were portrayed as that. Why are we doing it? Something like that.
Yeah.
That kind of, so there is this inherent racism. There is this inherent propensity to always think of India as a land of snake charmers, because, to be honest, we also have this kind of inferiority complex, and we are looking for Western recognition. And there is no finer example than that in the domain of Indian science. We always, things that come back from there are held much more in regard than things that we develop indigenously. And that goes to the amazing things that our scientists have done. We have forgotten, but we remember what others have done. So many things like that have happened. But coming back to this, I think people know it by heart now. Almost every day, you see an article in NYT, you see an article in WAPO, which is completely lopsided, selective, dripping with falsehoods and propaganda. We ignore it. 20 years ago, those things would have, and for example, even I have been a victim, an angry victim, where I have rebutted a really silly and specious article that was written by, can't even remember the guy's name, in NYT. This was on Delhi pollution. It was so horrendous, it angered me. I'm talking about 2014-15, that I wrote a rebuttal on that. Now I won't even, I probably use it as a, something to keep my samosas in. And so that is what has happened. When you overdo something, So even these propagandists are not, I call them chauthi fail anyway, but I think they haven't even passed third, because any propagandist, if worth his salt, would know ki, yaar, let's not, increase the speed of propaganda. Let's, kind of time it. But there are so many such, articles that are written almost every day that you ignore it, and so it is self-defeating for them. But they are too stupid to realize it.
Yeah. Right. And I think, speaking of distortions and lies, and I think if we have to look for the most recent example in national media, I think the whole issue of vaccines. And you're a scientist yourself, so could you tell us about what are the things that we need to know about the vaccines? Because once again, there is so much of distortion and misinformation about it.
Yeah, and I was not shocked by how the journalists were spreading the fake news and propaganda. What disappointed me was that there were people, there were fellow scientists who should have known better, who should have dug more and found out. So what it boils down to, an emergency usage authorization that has been given by the government to two vaccine makers. One of them is simply reproducing the vaccine that was designed and synthesized by AstraZeneca in Oxford. This is the Serum Institute of India. And that vaccine has been given emergency use authorization because they have shown their phase 3 results. But though the volunteers were all non-Indian, they still haven't shown the phase 3 efficacy results on 1,700 Indians that have been selected for their study. But their phase 1 and phase 2, remember, the vaccine has already been launched in Britain and some parts of the other world. So that is the vaccine that is going to be immediately rolled out. The other is the one which is indigenously designed, Bharat Biotech. It's an inactivated coronavirus vaccine. And it has been, the emergency use authorization has been given as a backup. So that is not going to be the vaccine that is going to be immediately used for inoculating masses, number one. Number two, according to the DCGI guidelines, they acted according to the rules, which is that for any vaccine which is using a used known platform, i.e. inactivated vaccine, and has already undergone phase 1 and 2 trials and shows very good safety as well as immunogenicity, this EUA can be given. So it is not that they acted against the rules. Now, these are rules, these are published rules. Journalists should know better, scientists should know better. Scientists should know that if safety is excellent amongst, not only the phase 1 volunteers, but also the safety that people have been, the experts have judged amongst the 22,000 volunteers during the phase 3 trial. They should know that when the immunogenicity in chimpanzees or non-human primates is excellent, some of the best, and that work has been put in public domain, why object to it? And especially when it's not going to be the vaccine given first up. But it's just sad, and it's one of those things that again, luckily it takes now, as I said, if it was 10 years ago, who knows, to what extent they would have taken this propaganda. A lot of disgruntled people coming in here, miscommunication, of course, to an extent by the government as well. But at the end of the day, now, things are back to normal. So, yet again, propaganda lasts for but a day or two.
Absolutely, Anandji. I think we have covered a lot of issues, I think all the way back 2 decades to the present one. And thank you so much. It has been an absolute enlightening and an enriching experience to listen to your insights, as always. Thank you so much for joining us at the Festival of Bharat. And I'm sure our viewers have a lot to think about, and you've given a lot of insights on a variety of topics. Thank you, Anandji.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. To our viewers, I would like to request you to continue supporting us, and please do subscribe to our channels, both the Festival of Bharat channel and the Citti Media channel, because we will be posting content on both of them. We will be back with another such fascinating conversation. So until then, take care and namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.